Lord Voldemort. For 70 years, Tom Riddle had done everything a human being could do to make himself immortal. He had split his soul into 7 pieces, hidden fragments of himself inside objects and creatures, built an army, toppled governments, and murdered hundreds in the single-minded pursuit of living forever. By the morning of the 2nd of May, 1998, he stood in the Great Hall of Hogwarts, believing he had finally won. Harry Potter had walked into the Forbidden Forest and died. The boy was gone. Nothing stood between Voldemort and eternity. Then Harry stood up. What followed was not the spectacular final battle that Voldemort had always imagined for himself. There was no sustained duel between titans, no prolonged demonstration of his superior power. Harry raised his wand and cast Expelliarmus. Voldemort cast the Killing Curse. The spells met in the air. What Voldemort had never understood, and never could understand, was that the Elder Wand had not been his since the night Draco Malfoy disarmed Dumbledore on the Astronomy Tower. The wand's allegiance had passed to Draco, and then to Harry when Harry took Draco's wand at Malfoy Manor. When Voldemort fired the Killing Curse with a wand that did not belong to him, at a boy whose death magic could not touch, the curse came back. He had no Horcruxes left. Neville Longbottom had already put a sword through Nagini's neck in this very hall. 60 seconds earlier, for the first time in decades, Voldemort was an ordinary mortal man, and ordinary mortal men die when the Killing Curse hits them. His body fell. It did not dissolve into light or rise in any form. There was no ghost, because his soul was too damaged to persist. Tom Riddle simply fell down and did not get up. Bellatrix Lestrange. By the morning of the 2nd of May, 1998, Bellatrix Lestrange had outlasted almost everyone. The other Death Eaters had fallen, fled, or surrendered, but she was still standing in the Great Hall of Hogwarts, still fighting, still laughing, the last loyal servant of a master who was himself already dead, though she did not know it yet. She had given everything to Voldemort, her freedom, her marriage, decades in Azkaban, her entire self. And she fought now with the particular ferocity of someone who has nothing left to lose. Then she fired a curse at Ginny Weasley. The curse missed by inches. That miss was the last decision Bellatrix Lestrange ever made. Molly Weasley stepped forward. The woman who had spent the war knitting jumpers and cooking dinners and worrying about her children placed herself between Bellatrix and Ginny and said, very clearly, words that became some of the most quoted in the entire conflict. Bellatrix laughed at her. She had always found the ordinary love of ordinary people contemptible. That small, domestic, embarrassing attachment that witches and wizards like Molly Weasley wore so openly. She had spent her life in service to a master who taught that such things were weakness. Molly's curse struck her in the chest. Bellatrix toppled. The woman who had given the Longbottoms a very uncomfortable time until their minds broke, who had killed Sirius Black, who had spent a decade in Azkaban rather than renounce her master, fell in the Great Hall like anyone else falls when a spell hits them squarely. Voldemort screamed when he saw her go down. That scream was the last sound Bellatrix Lestrange heard. She had been killed by exactly the thing she had mocked her entire life. Peter Pettigrew. Peter Pettigrew had been a coward his entire adult life, and it had kept him alive longer than almost anyone expected. He had betrayed James and Lily Potter to Voldemort in 1981, then faked his own death and lived as a rat for 12 years to avoid the consequences, then crawled back to his master when Voldemort began to return to power, then cut off his own hand to help resurrect him. In return, Voldemort had given him a silver prosthetic hand, magically conjured, stronger than flesh, a reward for faithful service. On the night of late March, 1998, Pettigrew was sent to the cellar of Malfoy Manor to check on the prisoners. Harry Potter and Ron Weasley were being held there. In the struggle that followed, Harry caught Pettigrew's wrist and looked at him, and for one moment, Peter Pettigrew hesitated. He did not complete what he had been sent to do. That hesitation was enough. The silver hand, enchanted by Voldemort and loyal to Voldemort's will, registered its owner's failure of nerve as treachery. It turned on him. The hand closed around Pettigrew's own throat and began to aggressive hug the life out of him. Harry grabbed at the silver fingers, trying to pull them away. Ron tried to help. Neither of them could move it. The hand that Voldemort had given Peter Pettigrew as a symbol of his value, as proof that he was trusted and rewarded, tightened until Pettigrew collapsed to the cellar floor and went still. He had survived everything: war, Azkaban's shadow, 12 years as a rat, Voldemort's service, and was killed by his own master's gift in the single moment he almost did something decent. Bartemius Crouch Jr. Bartemius Crouch Jr. had spent a year impersonating Alastor Moody, one of the most celebrated Aurors in wizarding history, and had done it so convincingly that nobody noticed. He had guided Harry Potter through the Triwizard Tournament, manipulated every obstacle, and delivered him directly into Voldemort's hands at the end of it. When it unraveled in the aftermath of the graveyard, he was captured, restrained, and brought to Dumbledore's office, where under the influence of Veritaserum, he told everything, the entire plan, every detail, every name. It was the most complete confession imaginable, and it should have changed everything. Cornelius Fudge arrived at Hogwarts that night with a Dementor as a personal guard, because that was the kind of decision Cornelius Fudge made. Before Crouch could be properly processed, before his testimony could be formally preserved, before any of the information he had given could be corroborated through official channels, the Dementor administered the kiss. The Dementor's kiss does not kill in any conventional sense. It extracts the soul through the mouth, leaving the body alive and breathing and entirely empty. Whatever Bartemius Crouch Jr. had been, fanatic, murderer, the man who helped give the Longbottoms a very uncomfortable time until their minds were gone, ceased to exist in any meaningful way in that office. His body continued. He did not. Dumbledore's response to Fudge was quiet and complete. You have no idea of the crime you have just committed. He meant the lost testimony, the destroyed evidence, the last chance to make the wizarding world believe Voldemort had returned. Crouch's hollowed body was sent to Azkaban. The information died with whatever had been inside him. Voldemort's return went unconfirmed for another year while the shell breathed on without him. Quirinus Quirrell. Quirinus Quirrell had spent a year with Lord Voldemort growing out of the back of his head, and the arrangement had been destroying him long before Harry Potter ever reached the underground chamber. Sharing a body with what remained of the most powerful dark wizard in history was not a sustainable condition. His skin had been deteriorating for months, his body weakening, the turban he wore to conceal Voldemort's face, a daily reminder of what he had given himself over to in an Albanian forest in pursuit of power he was never equipped to handle. On the 4th of June, 1991, he seized Harry's wrist in the chamber beneath Hogwarts, and his hand blistered immediately on contact. He did not understand why. Harry understood even less, but he understood that Quirrell was in pain. And so when Quirrell grabbed his face with both hands to stop him reaching the Philosopher's Stone, Harry reached up and grabbed Quirrell's face back. The protection Lily Potter had left inside her son's skin when she died for him 10 years earlier was not a spell in any conventional sense. It was something older and more absolute, and it treated Quirrell's touch the way fire treats paper. His hands cracked and blistered where they met Harry's skin. His face began to do the same. The flesh crumbled. He screamed. Harry held on through his own pain and his fading vision, held on until Quirrell's body gave way entirely and came apart, and Voldemort's spirit tore itself free of what remained and rushed through Harry like a wave of absolute cold. Harry lost consciousness before it was finished. When Dumbledore explained it afterward, the mechanism was simple. Lily Potter had loved her son, and that love was a thing Quirrell could not survive touching. Gellert Grindelwald. Gellert Grindelwald had once been the most powerful dark wizard alive, the man who nearly reshaped the entire wizarding world under his vision of magical supremacy, the man who had sought the Deathly Hallows and come closer to mastering death than almost anyone in history. By 1998, he had spent 53 years in a cell in Normangard, the prison he had built with his own ideology and his own magic to hold his enemies, which had then held him for longer than his entire reign of terror had lasted. When Voldemort arrived at Normangard in the spring of that year, he came for one piece of information: the location of the Elder Wand. He blasted through the cell door and stood over the oldest, most diminished version of a man who had once dueled Albus Dumbledore in what witnesses called the greatest magical confrontation of the age. Grindelwald looked at him and laughed. He told Voldemort nothing, or told him he did not know, which was functionally the same thing and also the truth, because the Elder Wand had not been his since the summer of 1945, when Dumbledore defeated him and took it. The wand's allegiance had passed out of his hands more than half a century before Voldemort came asking. He had spent all those decades in the prison he designed, stripped of the very object his entire life had been oriented around. And when the man who had supplanted him as the world's most feared dark wizard arrived demanding answers, Grindelwald gave him nothing. Voldemort game-overed him with the killing curse. He died in his own cell, in his own prison, protecting information he did not even have, which is either the most pointless death imaginable or the closest thing to dignity his life ever produced. Antonin Dolohov. Antonin Dolohov had been killing people for Voldemort since the First Wizarding War, which made him one of the longest-serving Death Eaters still standing by the morning of the 2nd of May, 1998. He had murdered Fabian and Gideon Prewett, two of the most capable Aurors of their generation, in a fight that took 5 of Voldemort's people to finish. He had cast an unknown curse across a darkened room in the Department of Mysteries that tore through Hermione Granger's chest and nearly killed her. He had been imprisoned in Azkaban, escaped when the Dementors sided with Voldemort, and returned to active service without interruption. He had survived everything the Resistance had managed to put in his path across 2 decades of conflict. When the Battle of Hogwarts began in the early hours of that morning, Dolohov moved through the castle the way he always had, purposefully and without hesitation, one of the most experienced dark wizards in the fight. The corridors of Hogwarts became close-quarters chaos as the battle spread through the building, Death Eaters and Defenders colliding in stairwells and hallways and classrooms. Filius Flitwick, who stood roughly 4 feet tall, and had spent the better part of 30 years teaching students how to make objects fly and candles light up on command, encountered Dolohov in one of those corridors. Flitwick had also, before his teaching career, been a dueling champion. Dolohov's decades of service, his survival of 2 wars, his long list of victims, none of it was sufficient. Flitwick ended him. Antonin Dolohov, who had killed some of the finest Aurors of his generation, was game-overed by the charms professor in a corridor of the school, and the battle moved on without pausing to acknowledge either of them. Fenrir Greyback. Fenrir Greyback had built his entire identity around being the most feared werewolf in Britain, and he had earned it deliberately. He did not become a werewolf by accident or misfortune. He had sought out a werewolf and arranged to be bitten as a young man because he wanted what it gave him, and he had spent the decades afterward infecting as many people as possible, targeting children specifically, building a generation of werewolves who had been turned before they were old enough to understand what had happened to them. He had given Remus Lupin his condition at the age of 4. He had mauled Bill Weasley badly enough to leave permanent scarring. He had attacked children named Lavinia and Montgomery, and others whose names the Wizarding Press barely recorded. He offered his victims to Voldemort as a resource, and received victims from Voldemort in return. By the morning of the 2nd of May, 1998, Greyback was inside Hogwarts, moving through the battle in a way that was less tactical engagement and more open predation, attacking anyone within reach regardless of allegiance. He encountered Ron Weasley and Hermione Granger in the chaos of the castle's corridors. Ron blasted him. Hermione fired at him. The spells hit, and Greyback went down in the confusion of a battle that had no time to stop and catalog its own dead. There was no climactic reckoning, no confrontation built around the weight of everything he had done. A man who had defined himself entirely by his capacity to hurt people, who had infected children to build himself an army, who had made suffering into a vocation, was knocked down in a corridor by 2 teenagers and left there while the battle continued past him in both directions. If you want to see more, click the video on screen now.